Hey there, it's Allison. Welcome to the Tiny Herd, where we talk about everyday pet care for guinea pigs, rabbits, and other small pets. Today's video is part 4 in my 5-part series teaching you step by step how to make fleece cage liners for your guinea pig cages. So far we have talked about tools and supplies, fleece and how to buy it. We've cut out all of our pieces. So if you've missed those 3 videos, I will have them linked down below. I highly recommend checking those out first. But in today's video, we are going to actually lay out and sew our liners together. I'm going to take you step by step through the process, and this might be a long one. So let's go ahead and get started. Alright guys, so before we can get setting things up for sewing, there's a couple of terms that I want to explain to you guys so that you understand the terminology I'm using throughout this video. This just has to do with sewing, and if you're brand new to sewing, then you might have never heard these before. So I wanted to make sure you understand the whole process. So you're going to hear me say when we lay these out that we need to have the right side up or the right side down, or I'll say make sure the wrong side is down, the wrong side is up. So if you look at this piece of fleece, this is the right side. This is the side that has the pattern. It looks really nice and clean. It has good colors. If you flip it over to the back, you might be able to see the contrast there. This side is a lot blurrier. The colors are not near as crisp. The back side of prints you usually can tell pretty easily because the back side is not going to look near as nice as the front side. I don't know if you guys can see that contrast in the camera, but this is definitely the good side, so this is the right side. So when we lay it out, I'm going to say make sure the right side is up, make sure the right side is down, and that is what that means. The other thing I'm probably going to talk about is seam allowance. So when we cut out our pieces, all of the measurements that I use, I take into account the seam allowance, and that is because we end up turning things inside out when we're sewing. So you'll see it'll make more sense when I set these things up, but basically the way we layer the different pieces of fleece, we're going to be sewing around them with everything inside out, leave a hole, and then we'll be turning it right side out. So basically the seam allowance is the amount that you are leaving to be the seam. So it will be what is between your stitching and the edge of the fabric. So when you are cutting things out and coming up with your measurements, you have to take into consideration the seam allowance to make sure you're leaving enough space. When I'm sewing fleece, I like to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so that is what you are going to see me use throughout this video. So at this point, I'm going to show you guys how to set up your liners for sewing. I'm going to show you guys using these smaller 1x1 pads, but this is going to be the same process for all of the pads and liners. So I'm going to talk you through this one, but then I'm going to do all of them and just speed it up, but show you guys on the smaller one so you know what we're doing. So I have my solid that's going to go on one side, and then I have my print that's going to go on the other side, and then I have my U-haul cut out here. So what you want to do is take a piece of your print, and you want it to have the good side facing you. So you can see this side is, well, you guys might not be able to see that, but this side is a lot fuzzier and blurrier than this side. So this is the good side, so I want that to be facing up. Then I want to take a piece of the solid and again, determine which side is the good side, and I want to put that facing down. And then take the piece of your U-haul and put that on the top. So you'll have your 3 layers like that. And you want the U-haul to be on the top because basically we're going to sew around this, leave a hole, and then we'll turn it inside out. So the good side will end up on the outside. So once you have it laid out like this, I usually just take either my sewing pins, or I do have some of these wonder clips as well. So you could either clip it around the outside like this, or you can just take a pin and pin all the way around it. So I know in this series I said you would need pins, so I'm assuming you guys have pins. So I'm going to go ahead and pin all the way around this. Okay, Okay, so I've pinned all the way around the outside of this. I'll be perfectly honest, when it's something this size, I usually don't use this many pins. Sometimes I don't pin at all, but I wanted to show you guys this. If you are a beginner and you're brand new to sewing, I would suggest using way more pins than you think, because this is going to hold all your layers together while you sew, and you don't want it moving around if you're trying to learn what you're doing. So you can see on the back here, it is pinned all the way through. It's through all of the layers, and everything is laid out all nice and flat. So when I sew this, which you guys will see here in a few minutes, I actually sew from this side on the top. So you'll see me put this side in my machine, because the U-haul is always a little bit bigger when I cut it out than the fleece, just because U-haul is a little bit thicker. For some reason it ends up being that way. And this way I can make sure I get through all of the layers without having to like keep flipping it over and making sure I've got my fleece. But you guys will see that when we start sewing. But now I'm just going to set up everything else for sewing.
Remember when you're laying this out that the number one thing to remember when you're making liners is that you want them to lay as flat as possible. If you don't have your pieces as flat as possible, then you're going to end up with those bubbles on your fleece that make it really hard to spot clean. So when you're laying these out, make sure you're getting them really nice and flat, and then clip or pin them really well so they can't shift around while you're sewing.
Okay, so before we get started sewing, let's talk about sewing machine settings a little bit first, because I get questions about this all the time. So here's my sewing machine. If you are brand new to sewing, you'll want to set up your new machine using the manual, learn how to thread it, learn how all of the different pieces and functions work using the manual before you want to get started, and you want to do a test piece before you start working on your actual liner. So just use some scraps and make sure that everything is working correctly. So for my machine, I just use the tension settings that are recommended for my machine. So my machine has like a thing in the manual, I think, that talks about like what are the best settings for just like general sewing. So I do have the tension set over here just to be kind of like a standard tension. I don't do anything special for sewing fleece when it comes to tension. When it comes to stitch length, the standard stitch length for a lot of sewing is 2. For fleece, I actually use like 2.5 to 2.75 because you are going through so many layers. It just gives you a little bit of extra strength there, that it's not so tight that it's stressing the thread. So those are the main sewing settings that I use. I don't do anything else special. So my sewing machine here is threaded. I have my bobbin in. The tension set, the stitch length is set, so I'm ready to start sewing my small pad. Alright, so we're going to start sewing with one of my small pads so that I can easily show you guys what I'm doing, and then we'll move on to a couple of bigger liners. I'll show you guys how to actually sew this small pad, and then a 2x2, and a actual big liner. So you'll be able to see on 3 different size projects how I do it, starting with this. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start right about here, and I'm going to sew all the way around the entire pad about a quarter or a half inch from the edge, and then I will leave a hole about this big, like 2 to 3 inches, so that we can turn it right side out. So I'm going to show you guys the sewing here. Make sure you take your pins out before your needle gets to them. If you have never sewn before, don't sew over your pins. And then I did want to show you guys, this is definitely not a needed thing, and I didn't include it in the supplies and tools, but this is actually a seam allowance guide that's magnetic on here, and I will link it down below. But I used the ruler that came with it and put it under my presser foot and set it at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So that keeps me sewing, that keeps me going 1/2 inch if I sew along the edge of that, which you guys will see in a minute. It keeps my seam allowance 1/2 inch from the side of the fleece. So that's what I use when I'm sewing fleece to help me stay on the line. You also can just measure it out with a ruler and then put a piece of tape. It just makes it easier to watch that to get your seam allowance than to like try to focus on the edge of the fleece. So that's just a tip. I'm gonna go ahead and sew this and show you guys what I'm doing. Alright, so we have our pad sewn here. You probably noticed, and I do want to mention, when I start and stop sewing, so whenever I first start my seam, I always backstitch a couple of stitches because that will secure that down. It's kind of the same thing as if you were like tying a knot, if you were hand sewing. So I do that at the beginning and the end, just so that it doesn't start to come apart when I am working on flipping the pad. Something else I wanted to mention, it's not as big of an issue with these smaller pads, but when you are sewing these, make sure you're keeping the fleece laying flat, but you don't want to be stretching it. So you don't want to like stretch one layer to make it line up perfectly with another layer, because that can result in you having like weird bubbles and lines on your pads and liners. So try to keep all of the layers just laying as nice and flat as possible, not stretched really tight or not like really loose compared to the other layers. So that's just a tip. But this one is done being sewn, so I'm going to go ahead and sew around the outside of the other pieces for the 2x2 and the liner, and I'll show you guys that. It's the exact same process, it's just bigger sizes. I'll give you a couple of tips on those as I go as well, and then I will show you what I do to flip these right side out and finish the pads. So I'm here ready to sew my big cage liner. So I've mentioned a couple times that I always like to have the U-haul on the bottom when I'm sewing, because I don't like to sew through the U-haul with that as the top layer. For some reason, whenever I cut out U-haul, I always end up cutting it bigger than the actual piece that I'm doing, if that makes sense. So like this piece of U-haul ended up being bigger than the pieces of fleece. I'm not really sure why, but when I have this situation, so I have it pressed up against my guide, like so that this is against my guide, not the U-haul, if that makes sense, because I know the U-haul's bigger. So I want to be 1/2 inch on the fleece, because the main goal is you want to make sure you're going through all 3 layers. So going off of the fleece instead of the U-haul ensures that I am catching the fleece layers. So that is what I do for the whole thing. When you're sewing cage liners, you want to try to keep it as like flat as possible so that the fleece is not shifting or stretching or anything like that, because that's what's going to cause those bubbles on the top of your liner when you go ahead and sew your inseams later on. So that'll make more sense when we get to the later steps, but just for now, try to make sure that all of your layers stay as flat and still as possible. Don't stretch anything, don't try to force anything, just go with what you have. That's why we make them a little bit bigger, so that you can have a good seam allowance and make sure you're getting through all the layers. So that's what we're going to do now, and I'm going to go ahead and sew this liner. Okay, so here's what I mean when I say you want it to lay flat. So when I do this on my sewed liner, I don't want there to end up being a big like bubble of extra fleece, if that makes sense. Like you want this to be laying really flat and smooth, because when we sew our inseam on this, if you have that big amount of extra compared to the underneath layers, you're gonna have these areas in your fleece where it's just wrinkled and it doesn't lay flat in your cage. All right, so we have our liner, our 2x2, and our small pad here. So the next thing that I'm going to do now that they're all sewn is I'm going to take each one and trim the excess off around the outside. So basically you just want to cut decently close to the edge. I'll show you guys how I'm doing this as I do it. So you just trim along, and then I also do trim my corners off. So I'll show you guys that as well. I'm gonna go ahead and do that and take you guys along with me. Okay, so you can see I've trimmed around the edge of everything, so there's just like a nice even amount. Make sure you don't cut through the seam again, because you don't want to undo the sewing you just did. But I also cut the corners off. That just gives you a nice sharper corner. I don't see a lot of people mentioning that when they talk about making liners, but that gives you a much sharper corner because there's not all that bulk trying to be in there. But that's what we're going to do. Now we will turn these right side out. When you are pulling your liners right side out, you want to make sure you are putting your hand in between the two fleece layers, not between fleece and U-haul. That's kind of what I was trying to show there. You don't want to pull from in between the fleece and U-haul layer, because that's just not the pieces that you want to be on the outside of your fleece. So make sure you're putting your hand in between the two fleece pieces, and I find it easier to put my hand in there and then grab one of the opposite corners and start pulling it out that way. It kind of just makes it the easiest way to pull the entire liner out. So that's a tip there, but I'm just going to pull these right side out and then I'll show you guys the next step. So we have turned our pad right side out now, and we are going to sew up the hole that we have left. So there's two ways that you can do that. You can hand sew it using a ladder stitch, or you can sew it by machine. So when I'm making liners and pads, I sew mine up by machine. You do see the seam when you do that, but I just think it lasts a lot longer when you do it that way rather than doing it by hand. So I'm going to show you guys how to do this using a machine, and then I'll see if I can find a good video tutorial on how to do a ladder stitch, and I will link that down below so that you guys can see how to do that if you don't want to see your seam. But I'm going to go ahead and show you how I sew this up. So first thing you want to do is make sure that your pad is laying nice and flat. So get it laying flat on your table exactly how you want it to be. Like you want it to be even. You don't want it pulled so that a ton of the solid is up on the top or anything like that. Like get it laid out nice and flat, as even as you can. Like basically you want it to look like how it's going to be finished. So take some time, make sure you get it all nice and flat. With a smaller pad it's not too hard, but when it comes to your liners, make sure you get them all laid out nice and flat. And I'll show you when I do that. I actually like to clip around mine as well, but I'll show you guys that in a little bit. For now, I'm going to show you how I sew up this hole on the smaller pad, and then I'll do it on the other pads as well so that you see it a couple of times.
What you want to do to close up the hole is roll the two edges of the hole under so that it basically matches the seam. So you want to roll them under the same way they would be if you had sewn them and rolled them in on the inside of the pad, if that makes sense. So basically roll them under so that they line up perfectly with the edge, and then clip them in place like I did here. So I'm getting ready to sew the seam to sew up the hole. So when you're doing this, you want to sew about as close to the edge of the fleece as you can, because you want to catch those pieces you tucked under and make sure you catch those with your seam. So I am starting on my pad above where the hole starts. So the hole starts about here, and I'm starting back here because I want that extra added strength. I don't want to miss any of the hole. I want to make sure I start before the end of the, I want to start before the hole and end before the hole. So I will end down here, the hole ends right here, and I'll end sewing somewhere down around here. So you want to, again, sew as close to the edge as you can to make sure you get the hole closed. Start and stop above and below the hole. We're going to go ahead and sew this up, and then I'll show you guys the end result. So here is the closed up hole. You can see from the side it looks exactly the same as the rest of the pad for the most part. You can see the seam on the top, but it lays really flat and it's not super noticeable that the seam is there. I just prefer to do it with the machine, even though that you can see it, just because it tends to last longer. So we're gonna go ahead and sew up the holes on all of the rest of the pads, and then I will show you guys the next step. Before I sewed up the holes on the 2x2 and the cage liner, I laid them out on the floor and made sure they were nice and flat. Like I've mentioned several times, the most important thing when doing liners is making sure that they're nice and flat. I even took some pins, and once I had it flat and even the way I wanted it, I pinned the layers together just so they couldn't move around as I was carrying it back and forth to my sewing machine, and just as I was sewing, things would stay together. So this is something that you can do especially if you are new to sewing. This will help your layer stay together as you're sewing. So I just did this with the 2x2 and with my cage liner, and then I also prepped the holes the same exact way. Curl the two sides under so that they line up with the existing seam. Basically, you want it to look exactly the same as the rest of the seam along the edge, and then I clipped that in place so that it stayed as well. Now that we have all of the holes sewed up on our liners, we are going to add the inseams. I'm not quite sure if inseam is the right word, but that's what I call it. So what I'm going to do is sew all the way around the pad, about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch. You can see it lines up pretty well with my guide here of 1/2 inch, but you'll be able to feel along the edge of the pad kind of where that inside seam is, the inside seam allowance. If you feel that with your fingers, you can tell where the bulk kind of ends. I want to sew around the entire pad, just top stitching around it right along that seam, and this will hold your layers together. So I'm going to go ahead and do that on this smaller pad, and then I'll show you the very last step. Alright guys, last step. So the very last thing that I do with my pads is I sew one more time to hold them together. For these smaller pads, a lot of times what I do is I sew an X across it because it's easy to go just from one side to the other. But the other thing that you could do is just sew another square inside the first square. That's just, you know, obviously a smaller square, and that will hold the middle layer together a little bit more. For this one, I'm just going to sew an X across it because that's really quick and easy, and that's just what I like to do for my these smaller pads. On the liners and the 2x2s, I do another square, and obviously I will show you guys that and kind of explain the difference there. So I'm going to go ahead and sew my X on this and show you this finished pad. Here is our finished small pad. No, the X is not perfectly in the center. You could measure it out if you wanted to, but since these are for my cages, I didn't care so much. I just wanted to have the X done. So this one is done. I'm going to do the last steps on the 2x2 and the full liner and show you guys that, and we will have finished liners. Here I have my 2x2 pad and my cage liner. You can see I've done my inseam about an inch away from the edge of each one. So now what I'm going to do is actually do a second inseam. So this is the corner of my cage liner. You can see where my first seam is there. So I have my tiny ruler here. It's just like a little 4.5-inch square. And I like to use this to just measure about like 1.5 to 2 inches away from the first seam that I did, and that is the guide that I use to sew a second seam around the inside. So it will be in a little ways, so I'll be sewing kind of along here, and that just gives you more stability in your liner and keeps your layers from shifting around, especially in the washing machine. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and then show you guys so you can kind of see a better representation when I'm done of what I'm talking about. So here are all the things that we finished making today. So we have our small pad with the inseam around it and the X across the middle. So that guy is all done. Just make sure you clip your threads at the end. Then we have our 2x2, which is done, and you can see how I did the second seam on the inside of that one. See it on the top layer as well. And then we have our actual cage liner under here. I didn't do the best job getting this line super straight and square because the bigger pieces are kind of hard to manage. So those take some practice. And this is the piece that it really focus on keeping your liners flat. I'm sure I've mentioned that, but try to keep it as flat as possible. Otherwise you end up with some of these like bubbles. This one turned out pretty good. It's not bad at all, but if you have big giant bubbles, it just makes it harder to spot clean. So today we sewed a full-size liner, we sewed a 2x2 liner, and then we sewed our smaller pads. That is pretty much the basics on how to sew liners. For any size you're doing, you just repeat this exact same process. You can customize whatever size you need. It's the same exact process for liners and smaller pads and all of that. So in the next video, I'm going to show you guys how we are prepping these liners for the cage. Okay guys, we have our liners sewed. You have a complete set of cage liners and small pads at this point if you chose to make small pads. So congratulations on making your first set. If you are sewing your very first cage set,
Let me know if you guys have any questions or comments down below. And if you are making your own set, tag me on Instagram. I would love to see you guys following my tutorial, and I would love to see what print you're using in your cages. So definitely follow me there or tag me in what you are making. But thank you guys so much for watching. Next video is going to be all about prepping your fleece, getting it ready for your cages, and then how to care for it going forward. Make sure you're subscribed if you're not already so you don't miss the last video. But thank you guys again so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.